power of religion for the goal of the communists. That's our conversation tonight, and particularly Jesuit Pope Francis. And this has a lot to do, frankly, with where our country finds itself right now. The voter fraud, the coup d'etat going on, and the ability to install a man into the White House, Joe Biden, who apparently is an agent of China. Seems like all the pieces are falling together nicely for China, don't they? Well, that's what we're going to talk about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the segment of Black Spring, and I have a bit of a treat for you. We'll see how it goes. It's a little bit of a stream with an Elizabeth Yore and her visit with the Pope at the Vatican, and she had some interesting information that kind of speaks to some of the dynamics and some of the things that are happening around here. So hopefully we'll see how this goes, and hope you guys are having a great weekend and off to a great week. And we'll get started right after this. All right, thanks so much. And I will be sharing the screen with you now. Hello to DJ Vision Barnett. And actually, before we go there, I want to say a word to the sponsors and also give thanks to those followers on Periscope, as well as you, the loyal subscribers, as well as the patrons. So thanks so much, guys. And this is a bit of a flash. This is a test on this one. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you for your patience. And we'll just have a word of thanks to our sponsors. If you're looking for great content creators on the subject of politics, news, culture, scripture, history, automobiles, culture, and much, much more, check out our sponsors, Derek C. Williams, Killer Whale Channels, The Definition of Anarchy, Joseph Francis Burton, Chrysler Imperial H, Little Miss Goth, AZ Infidel, Cold War Jesus, Anthony Scioli, and Let the Truth Be Told. And now, back to the news. All right, guys, thanks so much again. And we're going to go right on over. I think they're gearing up for the interview, so we'll go right over. Thank you guys so much for tuning in.
Of those who are Catholics as well as evangelicals in China. We'll talk about how indeed the communists have worked double time to take over not only the Catholic Church, but the Protestant Church. The world we should now begin right now. All right, next time you hear me, it's live, all right?
All right, everybody, if you're just now joining us, we're waiting for them to start this interview. And I'll give you a little bit, as much of the premise as I can give you. Um, Shout out to you, William Welch. Thanks so much for coming in. So, thanks so much, Killer Will, for sharing it out. It makes a huge difference with the AI these days. And so it looks like the premise of this is an attorney Elizabeth Yore. She has spent some time with the Pope Francis at the Vatican, and now she wants to expose some of the information or some of his plans with communist China and more. So we'll see what that looks like. This is a first on this one, so we'll see what happens. It may give us a little bit of insight. We've been talking quite a bit about the Great Reset, and of course, I'll get into that tomorrow. On tomorrow's show, we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening and what the forces, the elite are meeting and the meetings that they've had, and who else will show up. But the world is waiting with bated breath for the results of this highly contested election that we have going on here in the States. So you know every little bit helps. So maybe we can connect a couple of dots here, and then we'll sign off after that. So let's get back over and see. It looks like we're started up now. So thanks so much, guys, for tuning in, and thanks so much for taking care with the Channelytics and the AI, and thanks so much for being here on your holiday week.
Of communism or globalism. Christian apologist Francis Schaeffer describes such a relationship as co-belligerence, where we can disagree theologically, but come together on Judeo-Christian values of life and marriage and protection of children and family and religious liberty. And so isn't it nice when people can disagree but still be friends, can disagree and still be co-belligerent? And that's the kind of friendship I have with Elizabeth, and I appreciate that kind of friendship. So with that, let me welcome attorney Elizabeth Yore to the program. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, Brandon, it's great to be with you and your audience tonight.
Well, I know this hour is going to go by much, much too fast. Let me start with a quote by Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist. How interesting, Italian communist. He said, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. And yet that's exactly what we see happening today. You and I both, again, having become friends recently, have spent years studying this topic independently in relation to what's going on within the Protestant world and the Catholic world. I know firsthand, because I've written many books on it, Religious Trojan Horse, The Coming Religious Reich, Marxianity, that I wrote in 2018, that there is a battle within the Protestant church between the right and the left. Social justice or socialism is really at the key of it. Globalism, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. You bring the perspective of a Catholic who says, hey, there's a battle going on within the Catholic Church between the right and the left, just as Malachi Martin warned. And in one of his books in 1978, he said the foundation was being laid, the preparation for a Marxist pope. Well, you went to the Vatican a few years ago. Would you start by telling us about that visit with Pope Francis and what you observed?
I will. It was November 2013. Pope Francis had just become Pope in March of 2013. And quite frankly, I was excited to be going to the Vatican. He was having his first conference on human trafficking, which was my issue. So I was anxious to be in the heart of the Vatican and to learn and to share my experience with human trafficking with the people at the Vatican. Well, Brandon, I felt I was walking into a hornet's nest. I was in the heart of the Vatican. It was a small conference, about 80 people, but it was Obama people from the Obama administration, globalists from the UN, radicals from the NGO. They were talking about not human trafficking, but they were talking about global minimum wage. They were talking about climate change. They also mentioned that there was a connection between human trafficking and climate change. Well, I was shocked. I was like, what in God's name is going on? I'm in, the Vatican, where I've always wanted to be, and yet I felt like I was in enemy territory. And I met the Pope. I was in his presence for about 20 minutes as he met all the people who attended the conference. And I was very disturbed by, my gut was telling me something wasn't right, but I was not trusting my gut. I was, thinking, well, maybe I'm not right. But what I did when I left the Vatican conference, I promised myself that I would begin to investigate what was going on in the Vatican, because I left and my soul was unnerved. And I felt a sense of unease when I left the Vatican in this conference. It was as if I didn't believe my eyes and ears. I was shocked to know and see all these radicals talking all this globalism. And I was expecting to go to a conference where we were really going to talk about helping victims in this international sex trafficking. So what I realized and found out as I began down this path, this rabbit hole, into the catacombs of Rome and into the catacombs of my religion, is I realized that this Pope, Pope Francis, was embracing a globalist agenda. And Brandon, what I realized was that, to my horror, that embedded into the Vatican was the brain trust of George Soros. These men like Dr. Jeffrey Sachs from Colombia, head of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, head of the Millennial Development Goals. He was, I say, parked at the Vatican for the last 7 years. He has spoken as an expert over 30 times at the Vatican. He has also written documents for the Vatican and for the Pope. This has been the climate change agenda, which we all know is the mechanism by which they will impose the globalist, what used to be the New World Order, but now recently has become the global reset. And if you look at all the encyclicals of this, what I consider a pope from Argentina who had embraced liberation theology, and as you and I have talked, liberation theology was a creation of the Soviets in order to destabilize the Catholic Church in South America. And lo and behold, it did just that. It brought in Marxism to undermine the Catholic Church. Well, this Pope has, from the very beginning, both in his encyclicals and his conferences, has embraced this globalist agenda. He has undermined capitalism in encyclicals. He has written about the importance of humanism. He has talked about the importance of climate change, and really has transformed the Vatican in the last 7 years into a platform for the globalists. I always used to argue climate change never could find a moral voice, right? Leo DiCaprio wasn't going to fit the bill, and Al Gore wasn't going to fit the bill. But lo and behold, they have the moral voice in Pope Francis. And he has really he spoke at the UN promoting the Paris Climate Treaty. And similarly, in 2016, you may recall, the Pope got involved in politics. He called Donald Trump unchristian for building a wall. Now, I'm sure many of your audience has been to Rome and been to the Vatican and seen the 37-foot cement wall that surrounds the Vatican. So it's a little odd that he would be criticizing Trump in the importance, and he has criticized patriotic sovereignty. He has criticized capitalism, and he has been really on a rant against this administration. And that's why, in many respects, he's been called the political pope, because he has gotten involved in global politics, not pushing the agenda of the salvation of souls through Jesus Christ, our Savior, but rather talking about the globalist agenda, and really providing a platform time and time again for George Soros's brain trust and for all the globalists, not only in the United States, but also around the world.
Well, let's talk about that. So interesting because Luigi Tapernelli, a Jesuit, coined the phrase social justice in 1840. And then 8 years later, here comes Karl Marx, So again, we have a liberation theology with those Jesuits that we've warned about since their official creation in 1540. And then we know one of the guys pushing some of this ideas was Teilhard de Chardin, who, again, Malachi Martin quotes him and warns about what he was teaching, which is very interesting because Jesuit Malachi Martin became so concerned with what he saw happening, he was relieved. He requested to be relieved of his Jesuit duties, moved to New York, and began to write one best-selling book after another. And if you go read those books, and I have a friend of mine, John Leffler, who actually interviewed Malachi Martin, and I need to play some of those audio clips that I've been holding for a few months now that John graciously let me have. But if you go read some of his books, including one of his books that he wrote in 1978, Malachi Martin is saying, hey, folks, look out for the Vatican because they're preparing the way for a Marxist pope. Well, of course, we know the Jesuits have, as you said, pushed liberation theology for a long time. Down in South America, Francis Carney was a very well-known Jesuit that was down there fighting with the communists. He disappeared. Many people think that that he met his just judgment by the opposition as he was fighting on behalf of the communists. But Francis Carney was a well-known communist Marxist Jesuit. So again, this has been something going on for a long time. And you're so right about Pope Francis in regards to his picking up the mantle of globalism or international communism or whatever you want to call it, maybe communitarianism, mixing socialism with capitalism. It just depends on who we're talking about. But communism light is another way of describing communitarianism, which is really what's embodied in Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. In my book, The Coming Religious Reich, page 447, I quote the Sydney Morning Herald from June of 2015. Here's what it says. When Pope Francis seeks advice, one doesn't hesitate to respond, even if you're a German professor of physics. He's a German professor of physics who has been baptized as a Protestant and is no longer an active member of the church. The Pope is interfering in the writing of my book, says Hans Schulenhuber, jokingly told visiting Australian journalists on Tuesday, just days before he was to help unveil the pontiff's controversial encyclical on climate change in Rome. So here's this guy, not even describing himself as a Catholic anymore, but writing the encyclical of Pope Francis on climate change. And of course, what Schulenhuber is into is earth worship. As I detail, we won't go into it tonight. He's into earth worship, the idea of an earth constitution, a global council, a planetary court, the Gaia principles, the principles of Mother Earth, pantheism, all is God, panentheism, God is in all, which is so ironic because in the writings of Malachi Martin, he also warns about the rise of pantheism, the belief that all is God, from which we get this radical environmentalism. He warned about that when he warned about what the Jesuits would take on. So this is very, very troubling. Let me read to you also what in the Keys of the Blood, the Keys of this Blood, Malachi Martin, he says some idea of the confessional enmity entertained by Masonry for the Roman papacy can be gleaned from the permanent instruction drawn up a few years after the Congress of Vienna in 1819 to 1820 by the French, Austrian, German, and Italian Grand Masters of the Lodge. Okay, here are the Masons, he says. It's again quoting former Jesuit Malachi Martin, saying all of these Masons got together and they wrote a document. And here's what they said, quote, We must turn our attention to an ideal that has always been of concern to men aspiring to the regeneration of all mankind, the liberation of the entire world, and the establishment of the republic of brotherhood and world peace. Among the many remedies, there is one which we never forget: the total annihilation of Catholicism and even of Christianity. What we must wait for is a pope suitable for our purposes, because with such a pope, we could effectively crush the rock on which God built his church. Seek a pope fitting our description. Induce the clergy to march under your banner in the belief that they are marching under the papal banner. Make the younger secular clergy and even the religious receptive to necessity, or receptive to doctrines. Within a few years, this same younger clergy will of necessity occupy responsible positions. And he goes on to say, some will be called upon to elect a future pope. This pope, like most of his contemporaries, will be influenced by those humanitarian principles which we are now circulating. So what's Malachi Martin, the former Jesuit, warning about in his book, The Keys of the Blood? He's saying, hey, going back to the 1819, 1820, the Masons from Austria, Germany, Italy, France, they got together and said, hey, we need to make sure we elect ourselves eventually a Marxist pope. And clearly, folks, that is what they have done. Which brings us to this question: what is this pope doing to further communism? And this brings us to an article over at the website of my guest, attorney Elizabeth Yore. Her website is Yore Children, Y-O-R-E is how you spell her last name, Y-O-R-E. And so her website is yourchildren.org, because what she does is she works with child rights issues related to sex trafficking. So her website, yourchildren.org, you'll find this article. You'll also find it on our website. She gave us permission to carry some of her columns. You'll find it over at worldviewtimes.com. And the article is, did Cardinal McCarrick make a secret deal with communist China for the Vatican? So if Pope Francis is a Marxist, and we have every reason to believe that he is, what is he doing to undermine freedom around the world? Let's start with China. In 1980, apparently this cardinal, who, by the way, I see is back in the news this week. Maybe you can tell us why this cardinal is back in the news. But Cardinal McCarrick, well, he was approached by the KGB, you say, in the 1980s. Tell us, first of all, why is he back in the news, and then pick it up with why the KGB was interested in him in the 1980s.
Sure. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick was the most powerful prelate in the United States, probably around the world, for about 20, 25 years. He traveled around the world for all of our presidents, I might add, as a diplomat, pushing the interfaith dialogue. You'll recognize that, Brannon. He was a serial predator of the worst kind. He was a monster and had preyed on boys and seminarians throughout his entire career. But because he was a prolific fundraiser and was able to silence other prelates and silence the victims, he was able to, for probably 50 or 60 years, continue on his not only path to power, but also his path of destruction upon all these victims. Interestingly, and I think I'll go back a little bit. In 1929, Bella Dodd was the head of the Communist Party in the United States of America. And on directions from Moscow, she was ordered to hire 1,100 men and insert them into the seminary system as communist infiltrators into the Catholic Church. She was enormously successful, not only in recruiting these men, but also in 1954, she said some of them are in important positions as cardinals in the United States as well as in the Vatican. So there was a concerted effort by Moscow and the communists to insert into the Catholic Church communists. One of the people, it has been said, who was one of those recruits at some point was Ted McCarrick, because he went to St. Gallen, Switzerland, which is one of the headquarters for training of communists. And there is, to this day, a recognition that St. Gallen has become the training capital of the communists. In the 1990s into the 2000s, there was a group of radical cardinals who met every year in St. Gallen, Switzerland, to plan for the next pope after John Paul II. Your audience will know and remember John Paul II was the Polish pope. He was anti-virulent against communism. The KGB had a meltdown when he became pope because he was battled them when he was Cardinal of Krakow. And lo and behold, he became the Pope. He and Reagan and Margaret Thatcher worked together to bring down, end the Cold War. But these modern cardinals who were meeting in secret in St. Gallen, they even called themselves the St. Gallen Mafia. And it's believed that McCarrick, this predator cardinal who was climbing up the ladder in the Catholic Church in America, also would meet with them. We're plotting to make sure that the next pope would be a radical Marxist, would be a communist, and would carry on the modernist agenda. Well, they didn't succeed in 2005. To their horror and frustration, Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, became the Pope. He was anti-climate change. He pushed very vigorously to re-Christianize Europe. And you can imagine the globalists and Soros who wanted to flood all of Europe with Muslim refugees. They did not like having Pope Benedict in place. Lo and behold, he stepped down in 2013. And then the St. Gallen Mafia had their opportunity to install Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina, Pope Francis. And one of the first things he did, Brandon, when he became Pope was write to President Xi of China. And in June of 2013, he reached out to Cardinal McCarrick. And by the way, Cardinal McCarrick had been to China by that time about 8 times. He was going to China when nobody was going to China. Nobody was allowed to go to China. Pope Francis, even though he was told that McCarrick was a predator and that there was a file this high in the secret archives about McCarrick's abuse of seminarians. He sent him to China to begin negotiations with the communist Chinese to start a negotiation that would ultimately result in a secret deal in September of 2018, the first deal ever between the Vatican and the CCP. This deal was to allow, if you can imagine, allow the Communist Chinese Party to appoint bishops to the Catholic Church. And this deal, we still don't know the details of it. This deal has been renewed. And as a result of this horrendous deal, Pope Francis has remained silent over the persecution of Catholics and Christians in China. And by the way, you know, because I know you've covered it, there has been a huge uptick in persecutions of Christians in China as a result of this deal with the Vatican. It's a demolition derby of churches, of crucifixes, of crosses. And that is the result of this secret deal between Pope Francis and the CCP.
But at the same time, Elizabeth, wasn't Obama part of this as well? Surely Obama knew what was going on. And one reason why I say that is because I stumbled on this in my research years ago, shortly after it came out. This article from the Chicago Mag, chicagomag.com, the end of community organizing in Chicago, ? And the article talks about none other than Barack Hussein Obama. And the article says, It has now been more than 4 years since Barack Obama threw an arm around Gregory Galuzzo in Iowa and confided that whenever anybody asked how his presidential campaign had so quickly assembled its grassroots operation, he would credit Galuzzo's membership, a former Jesuit priest who'd been drawn to Chicago by the work of Saul Alinsky. Of course, that's Saul the Red Alinsky. So this Jesuit, Galuzzo, Obama admits, according to Chicago Mag, helped him win the primary in Iowa, go on to become president. So my question to you, Elizabeth, is surely Barack Obama knew about this, was fine with it, and so now you have really, I believe, the coming together of these two men that allow for the kind of persecution taking place in China that you're talking about, which is under his presidency, 8 years of Obama, we saw this rapid growth of persecution of Christians. You're saying under the rise of Pope Francis, you see the persecution of traditional Catholics. Then we see under Obama the rise of persecution of evangelical Christians. So there seems to be a scissor strategy that's coming here. So what role did Obama play in this?
Well, let me tell you, the plot thickens. In 2014 and 2015, Barack Obama and Joe Biden picked up the phone and invited none other than Cardinal Ted McCarrick into the White House, into the SCIF, to discuss a secret plan, another secret plan. You know, this is the communists like to deal with secret plans. To normalize relationships between the United States and communist Cuba, the brutal regime of the Castro brothers. And
who, by the way, Castro went to Jesuit schools.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And between Pope Francis and Ted McCarrick and Joe Biden and Barack Obama, they began secret diplomatic channels between Cuba, Havana, the White House, and the Vatican. And the Vatican assisted the Obama administration with the help of Ted McCarrick, the serial predator, to normalize relations. Now, Brandon, these negotiations were so secret that the Cuba person on the Cuba desk at the State Department didn't even know they were going on. And the reason why is because, as you know, and as we saw in this recent election, the Cuban Americans would have been in an uproar and would have fought to end the negotiations. But it became a fait accompli. And so as a result, fortunately, the Cuban Americans have, understand that they fled this repression and communist brutality where many of their family members were killed and tortured and imprisoned for life. And so Barack Obama, Francis, and McCarrick, and Joe Biden negotiated in secret and normalized relations to the horror of our freedom fighters, the Cuban Americans, the great Americans in Miami. So it continued. There were several backdoor deals that they were between. And so there were no backdoor deals with Benedict. There were almost immediately. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Barack Obama his second term began, and shortly thereafter, Francis became Pope. And then began these negotiations to promote climate change, to undermine the 2016 election, to promote communist countries, and as a result, to silence the Vatican. The moral voice of the Vatican has been muzzled as there is this huge uptick in Christian persecution. And the Pope has not said word one about what's happened in China. He has said not word one about what has happened in Hong Kong and the freedom protests. And so, quite frankly, whether the CCP bought Pope Francis's silence, it has been enormously effective in silencing him at a time when we need the Vatican.
When you said bought, wasn't there some kind of $2 billion deal or something?
Yes, there's been allegations by Chinese dissident that at from 2014, every year, the CCP has sent $2 billion to the Vatican. And many people say that, well, that's standard operating procedure with the CCP. They buy off countries, they buy off leaders, this is how they operate. There has been no denial from the Vatican. And certainly they've got their $2 billion worth because, in 2017, President Xi was at Davos, where all the globalists meet and plan how they're going to subject we the people, into their vast, plan. And President Xi said something very interesting, and he was not waxing poetically. He said in 2017, all roads lead to Rome. And I think he was pointing out to the world that Rome was going to be the center of the Belt and Road Initiative, that Italy was going to be the center of the CCP Belt and Road Initiative around all of Europe. And sadly, and actually, to my horror, he has a partner in Pope Francis. And it hasn't stopped. Do you know that the Pope has said, the Pope has praised the Chinese handling and containment of the virus? The Pope has praised the Chinese donor program, which many have called genocide. The donor program where they have taken and stolen organs from the Falun Gong, from all various persecuted Christians. They have called that a great program. The Vatican has.
And yet they're harvesting some of those organs while those people are alive, correct?
Yeah, that's right. They've harvested those organs while people were alive. The Pope has also praised the CCP, the China's handling of the climate. The Pope has said that of all the countries in the world, the Pope's right hand has said this, that China is the best implementer of the Vatican and Catholic Church's social justice initiative.
Well, what's very interesting is that in 1978, this is from Reason magazine, 1978, the article's entitled The Final Conclave. Remember now, written in 1978. And it's specifically talking, Elizabeth, about the book by former Jesuit Malachi Martin that came out that same year. Listen to this. In the first 100 pages of his book, Martin piles one piece of evidence upon another to nail down his point, almost to overkill, that the Catholic Church has consciously followed a policy of appeasing communist totalitarian regimes. The author's answer, for which he presents elaborate documentation, is that the Vatican believes that the communists will soon control Italy. Rome is in Italy, the Vatican is in Rome, and for the sake of its own survival, the Vatican must accommodate itself to whatever government exists in Italy. The Church's secret papers, detailed in this volume, cite piece after piece of evidence that in the next decade of all the governments of Western Europe will be Marxist. If the Vatican then opposes Marxism, it will be either exterminated or made subservient to the Marxist wave of the future. And since survival is the Vatican's first responsibility, it must make an accommodation with the rulers to be. As for the United States, it will become gradually weaker, both economically and militarily, and will, for its own survival's sake, ally itself with Saudi Arabia and let Europe go communist. Is that not what has happened? I mean, we all remember watching Donald Trump go over to Saudi Arabia, do we not? And watching that, I was in the middle of the night here in America. The article goes on from 1978, reviewing the book by former Jesuit Malachi Martin, who, again, became so disillusioned with the Marxist infiltration of the Vatican and particularly the Jesuits that he gave up his duties and moved to New York and started writing both documented books on the Jesuits, including this one that was a New York Times bestseller, but other books like the Keys of the Blood, as well as another one called Windswept House. But this article from 78 says, traditionalists wish to retain the emphasis of Catholicism on spiritual and not material wealth, and to discourage involvement in the political arena. Progressives and radicals favor the conscious adoption of a pro-Marxist policy. The proponents of accommodation with the Marxist wave of the future gain more adherents as the conclave continues. If the church, meaning the Catholic Church, does not align itself with the proletariat, that'd be the Marxist terms of the workers, it will be dead within a generation. This is the argument that sticks most in their minds, talking about those who would pick the Pope and pick a Marxist Pope. Isn't that fascinating that in 1978, there's a publication and pretty much everything that Malachi Martin was saying has come true?
Well, he's a visionary. You know, he worked in the Vatican many years. He was in the Vatican archives. He was very close to a number of the popes, so he understood the political winds very well. And in his and he wasn't afraid to call them out. And he understood and read the tea leaves about what was going on and tried to warn the American Catholic Church, especially as the strongest church in the 1960s and 70s, to not to embrace modernism. And, you know, this is what climate change and the Gaia, you know, and it's important for people to be really critical thinkers like you are, Brandon. The language that they use is, for example, and this Pope does this, they want to return the soul to Mother Nature. Mother Nature doesn't have a soul. Man has a soul.
Yeah, this is just total cosmic humanism, pantheism, panentheism. You know, it's interesting, too. It's amazing the things you say, and then I have the research on the desk. We've not rehearsed any of this. In 1884, Catholic priest P. Hutchety, professor of theology, Grand Seminary of Laval, France, in the history of the Antichrist, wrote, quote, "But it does not suffice to destroy. It is only absolutely necessary to build up again. The world cannot subsist long in a vacuum. It must have a religion. It must have a philosophy. It must have an authority. A revolution will furnish all these. Instead of the reasonable and supernatural religion of Jesus Christ, revolution will preach pantheism," in quote, pantheism, all is God, Mother Earth, Gaia. 1884.
Humanism, fraternity.
Yeah.
Those are the buzzwords that, you know, we have to be very aware of. For example, they will use this language. We all seek a common home.
A common good.
A common destiny. Communism.
Yes, common good. You know, in his encyclical, I counted up in my book how many times the Pope used the phrase common good over and over, whether it's social justice, common good, you know, shared community. These are all masking terms. And of course, the one they're going for now, Elizabeth, is not stakeholder, not shareholder, but stakeholder capitalism. Now it's stakeholder capitalism, not shareholder as in you put your capital to risk and you buy a share in a company. No, stakeholder capitalism, and everybody has a stake. So when a company comes to your town and they build a building, okay, now that's impacting the climate and you have a stake in that, good or bad. Therefore, you should benefit from what that company does and get some of the profits or something coming back to the community, because all people have a stake in how that company impacts their community, physically, financially, environmentally. So now the phrase is not shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism. And let me ask you this, because we're going to have to move really quick here. This Great Reset, you know, this is where they're going. And Hillary Clinton is now on a video pushing this. Prince Charles with all his new age cosmic humanist, Gaia Earth worship type theology is pushing this. Charles Schwab, not Charles Schwab, what's his? Klaus, thank you. That's the financial guy. Klaus Schwab is saying that we're all going to have to come together in a new way of biological and spiritual, and they're openly pushing at the World Economic Forum that he heads up, as we did a show early in the year, their interactive wheel, and their interactive wheel put the COVID right at the center. And if you go to our TV show, our TV page, folks, wvwtv.com, you'll see on the right-hand side a link to that whole 1 hour. We were the first TV show to show you that interactive wheel live on the air. It's in that TV show now, archived at wvwtv.com. And right at the center, Elizabeth, is COVID. And then you can spend days on there. But they're calling for global governance. Their words, not mine. They're calling for a digital economy. Basically, what is social credit scores, climate change, so many of these other things they're talking about. Now, that's what's going to be going on at the January 2021 Great Reset Conference that all of these globalists are pushing. And really, Pope Francis has already bought into it because it's all based on sustainable development. Agenda 21 from the Earth Summit in Rio in '92 that George H. Bush signed America into. And now it's called Agenda 2030. And Pope Francis has signed right onto it. By the way, there are many in the Protestant church here in America that have signed right onto it. And by the way, many within the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant association or denomination, whatever you want to call it, they passed a resolution a few years ago, Proposition 9, I think it was, Resolution 9, affirming critical race theory, Marxism. This is the stuff I wrote about in my book, Marxianity. And by the way, I have a book from the early 90s where then the president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Christian Activist Division, Richard Land signed on to this UN document that I still have in my files. So what's really ironic is you have the Protestant churches, you have the Southern Baptist Convention, you have the Catholic groups. There's a war going on between the right and the left in both of these groups. And so Pope Francis is pushing, along with these others, the Great Reset. So with that being said, the Great Reset is coming. I think the COVID was released. It was spread on purpose. It's damaged our economy. It's brought in fear. It's brought in great anxiety. It's destroying many businesses, small businesses. It's allowing the international businesses to continue. And then we bring in the issue of the Great Reset and resetting the dollar and going to a global currency, which, by the way, the emergency coronavirus legislation they offered up at the beginning of the year had a digital dollar in there, and then they pulled it out. Well, when they do that, folks, they finally get that. That will allow them to reset the currency and take away 40% of your purchasing power. Boom, gone. So this will also allow them to move on to what is called modern monetary theory. They won't have to worry about taxing you so much because they can tax you through the hidden tax of inflation, Keynesian economics. As John Maynard Keynes said, by a continuous process of inflation, we can inflate the currency and destroy the majority of the people's wealth, and not one man in a million will know what we're doing. So they don't have to tax you by saying, we're going to raise your taxes. They tax you by destroying the purchasing power of your dollar. And what are the central banks of the world doing with their headquarters in Basel, Switzerland? They're all buying up, as you can go see, large amounts of hard assets. What does the Vatican own? A ton of hard assets. Probably the first or second largest property owner in the world. So, Elizabeth, we see that they are preparing for not only a reset with national sovereignty and moving away from nationalism as in borders, but to a globalism, but they're going to call for a reset of the world's economy. And by destroying it, more people will be open to it, because a lot of people who didn't want international socialism, well, now that their business has been destroyed by politicians, now they're like, well, what choice do I have? They've taken everything from me. This is making a lot more people accept the idea of the Great Reset. What say you?
Yes, and they did it in 8 months, didn't they?
Yeah.
It happened in 8 short months. And, what I also want to warn your leaders, your listeners, is that they're going to use promises of utopia on earth. Jeff Sachs, the expert, at the Vatican, the Soros Brain Trust, wrote a book called The End of Poverty. They will promise the end of poverty, global peace, utopia on earth. And they will also do that in the same breath. They will push the panic button, much like Paul Ehrlich did with the population bomb. They will say, fear tactics, the sky is falling, we are at the tipping point, we must do this, and we have the solution. It's the Sustainable Development Goals. But folks, what I learned when I was at the Vatican, and I'm going to share this with you, with Sustainable Development Goals, they keep moving the goalpost. For example, when I was at the Vatican, they said, if we adopt Sustainable Development Goals, we will end human trafficking, sex trafficking in 2020. Brandon, I was like, Well, I'll be around hopefully in 2020. Then not only 2 months later, they were talking at the UN, and it was the deadline was 2015 or 2030. And so they keep moving the goalposts, thinking that nobody is going to be paying attention. They're going to make promises about peace, ending poverty. This is utopia on earth. And as we Christians know, Christians believe that our earthly goal is eternal salvation, not utopia on earth.
Well, that's just straight Karl Marx. I mean, that's naturalistic humanism. That's materialism. That's dialectical materialism of Karl Marx that we talk about in so many of our publications. We've only got now about 11 minutes. So again, the time is getting away. Let's talk about sex trafficking. Let's talk about people that are compromised. We see that the cardinal, they go to Cardinal, what's his name, McCarrick, and the FBI says, hey, we noticed the KGB, this is in the 1980s, we noticed the KGB wants to grab a hold of you, now come work for us. He told him no, didn't he?
Well, that's what the footnote they did a report, the Vatican did a report on McCarrick because it was such a huge scandal in the church. But buried in a footnote, and because I'm a lawyer, I look at footnotes, is a little vignette about McCarrick was approached in the 1980s by the deputy head of the Soviet mission at the UN, who was a known KGB agent and operative. And he was trying to flip McCarrick to talk, to be an agent, an asset for the KGB. You know, obviously McCarrick would have been a prime contact because, number one, he traveled the world. He went to the Vatican at least 5 or 6 times a year. He was blackmailable, and he could be bought off by the KGB. Now, the note makes it unclear whether or not he was able to, and what happened was the FBI was watching this deputy head of missions, and all of a sudden the FBI said, oh my God, this guy's talking to Cardinal McCarrick. We better talk to Cardinal McCarrick and see if we can get him to be one of our assets, a counterintelligence asset. Well, McCarrick apparently didn't want to have anything to do with working for the FBI. My question is, did Cardinal McCarrick work for the KGB? That's the unanswered question. And if you look at this report that was just finished by the Vatican, McCarrick went to Russia the next year. He went to Moscow the following year. He went to Beijing the next year. He went to Cuba. So, you know, my sense is that he was very comfortable in around communist countries and operating within the communist political system. So, you know, this is the tip of the iceberg.
What about what about you know, people like Joe Biden? What about other politicians? I mean, Joe Biden's just flat out creepy. You have an article called the Creep Factor about Joe Biden and his sniffing of hair right out there in public, where everybody can see that he's doing this and other things he does. I mean, how many of these politicians do you believe are being controlled because of their fooling around with maybe children? And what do you see? I'm not accusing Joe Biden of anything because I don't know anything, but what's going on with Joe Biden and the way he acts with kids in public? Why did you write the article called The Creep Factor, which of course I think Joe Biden is an agent of China. That's my opinion based on what I'm watching with his son. So again, it seems like it's all falling into place real well for them to put this guy to the White House. Now, I know that tonight folks are probably really upset about the news about Sidney Powell, but my sources are saying just chill, wait. This may be something different. Let's just see what happens. But if Biden gets in, you got a guy that I think is an agent of China, but maybe like McCarrick, he has a little bit of a creep issue. What say you?
Well, you know, my lying eyes don't deceive me. You know, we've all talked about, right, the sniffing of children's hair, the repeated obsessive sniffing of children's hair. There's a name for it. You know, psychologists understand that it's called trichophilia. I'm not going to diagnose him, but that behavior, which gives all of us kind of the creep factor, are very concerned, is a diagnosed sexual disorder. Be that as it may, look at the Hunter Biden laptop. You want to look at sexual preferences and behavior and peccadillos that Hunter Hunter is highly blackmailable. That horrible laptop, which had not only, I'm told, child porn, all sorts of possible sexual crimes against children on it, let alone all the financial fraud in investigation in curious, very troubling behavior with the Chinese Communist Party, including billions of dollars from Ukraine, billions of dollars from the CCP. That is what is going to be on Air Force One. Hunter Biden is probably hoping that Air Force One is being revved up for his next trip to Beijing. I mean, these are the kinds of people that the KGB and the CCP, because they are blackmailable, they will approach them with be able to turn against their country, to turn against and buy them off because they have secrets that they don't want the world to see. And the sex trafficking, whether it's at the Epstein level or at the street level, this is a criminal activity that operates in secrecy. And so your audience, and I've having spent 30 years finding children, looking for missing kids, protecting children, I trust the American people. When their gut tells them something's wrong, that a child might be in trouble, they intervene oftentimes. They pick up the phone and call the police. They're the ones who find missing children. That's the dirty little secret. It's the American people.
Well, that brings up a very interesting point. Why are the U.S. Marshals? Why is the FBI? They find them every now and then. But if we can track down Iranian generals and number 1 and 2 of Al Qaeda through their phones and computers and drone strike them, you're telling me we can't find these sex trafficking rings in America? I have to wonder, did the FBI reportedly turn a blind eye to Jeffrey Epstein? Did they know for a long time that Jeffrey was up to what he was doing and people had complained about him? Do we have at the highest levels of our government sex rings being used to co-opt religious leaders, business leaders, financial leaders, and politicians? And I think the reason that all these sex rings have to be found out by the neighbors and the people who find them, and something in their gut tells them it's wrong, and they end up intervening instead of the government, is because I think our government largely has become a corrupt mafia, a corrupt government deep state mafia that wants these sex rings because they exploit them the same way they largely exploit the drug ring and profit from that as well. That's my opinion.
Well, it's very lucrative. Sex trafficking is more lucrative than gun running and drugs because they can use these children again and again. And my concern is that, look, they've had the Hunter Biden laptop since 2019, probably even earlier than that, and nothing was done. Kids are on the low level of federal law enforcement and even state, they don't want to do those cases. Those require hard work. And in my opinion, the biggest rewards are when you find and rescue a child. There is no high like saving a child's life. And yet the law enforcement operatives, both in the FBI and elsewhere, they're not interested in breaking these cases, especially when they start looking that there are powerful people who are operating and exploiting these children.
What did you make of Ted Gunderson? Did you ever know Ted Gunderson? Is he credible? He's a former FBI agent that I think at one time even ran the FBI field office here in Memphis and other places. But his speeches are out online. He's passed away. He actually passed away here in Memphis, I think in his 80s a few years ago. Was he credible?
Yeah, I believe he was credible. I did not know him. He was really set out as I think a leader in this area, kind of one of the few brave patriots, heroes who.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in on this 11th hour flash stream. I really appreciate it. This is a bit of a fully loaded interview here. It's actually coming to a close, so I'll give you guys. We'll go ahead and finish this one out, and I don't know, maybe I'll open it up for a bit and then we'll close out. Thank you guys so much for tuning in on your holiday weekend.
did.
pornography. I was stunned at her speech.
She did. And I would encourage, families whose children, I talk to a lot of young lawyers, young law enforcement people who really want to make a difference in sex trafficking, and this scourge, this scourge that destroys lives. And I would encourage them to get involved in federal and state law enforcement.
But let me ask you this: don't the globalist, the communist, the Islamist, don't they all profit? ISIS, don't they all profit from sex trafficking?
Oh, sex trafficking. ISIS is now into sex trafficking because it is so lucrative.
What's the deal going on with sex trafficking in China? What goes on there?
Well, what happens in sex trafficking in China is because of the one-child policy. There's a huge deficit of women, females, in 200 million missing females in China. And so as a result, they are trafficking, abducting women from all over Asia into China because of their insane one-child policy that has caused this disproportionate male-female ratio. And so as a result, sex trafficking has skyrocketed in China as well as around the other countries.
And quickly, talk about people who are missing. You just mentioned all these gals that go missing. What about all the Christian, evangelical Christian and Catholic kids that have just gone missing by the thousands reportedly in Hong Kong? Hasn't the COVID provided a nice cover for that? And I understand there are a lot of evangelical Christian kids and Catholic kids, young people who are protesting the CCP's takeover of Hong Kong, and thousands of those kids are missing, and now their families don't know where they are. Are you hearing the same thing?
Yes, I am, and they're in mainland China, and Americans have to scream bloody murder to get those kids returned, because guess what? Pope Francis has been silent about those children and pastors.
Well, here's Malachi Martin again writing in his book, Windswept House. It was a fictional book based on fact, and the description of the book said the Cold War's ended with a scope and daring not possible until now, an unlikely international alliance of top-level political, financial, and religious interest sees the way clear at last to its ultimate goal, the establishment of a single global society utopia. These are men with nothing in common but immense power and a towering ambition for still more, with world unity and prosperity as their slogan. And what is Biden's slogan? Build back better, right? That's a UN slogan, by the way. And with betrayal, scandal, and murder as their ready weapons. Look at that. With betrayal, scandal, sex trafficking, and trap people, and murder as their ready weapons, they have the means and the will to capture the perfect global machinery for their plans. The oldest, wildest, and most stable political chancery in the world, the Vatican. And that's from the book by Malachi Martin, a former Jesuit, warning years ago. My guest has been attorney Elizabeth Yore. Her website is Yore, Y-O-R-E, Your Children, Y-O-R-E, that's her last name, yourchildren.org. Elizabeth, I know we'll have you back. Thank you for being my guest tonight.
Thank you, Brandon. It was a delight to be with you too.
All right, guys. Thank you so much once again for tuning in to this segment of Black Spring with Autumn. And, as I mentioned, that was a bit loaded. I wasn't quite sure, but, they did talk quite a bit about they did go over quite a bit of a timeline when it came to I guess, can I say the papacy and the evolution of the popes. And many people have had their perspectives on the current pope, and I think it's been more than mixed. Let me say that much. So I really appreciate you guys so much for coming in. But they did get into quite a few things. They did talk just a smidge about the Great Reset and some of those contributing factors. They talked about the sustainable development. These things are all well documented. You can always go onto the UN.org and find out what the Agenda 2030 is, or what the Agenda 2021, what that looks like. I mean, these are things that are already in place, that have been in place. And yes, so yeah, they got into just a little bit of got into just a few things. But the current pope, he's called for many things. Even earlier this year, he did call for the nation states to give up, relinquish your sovereignty. Nations can no longer handle such great responsibility. And we've done these items on the channel earlier this year, and I really appreciate it. And so thank you guys so much for coming in. I'm going to do just a hello to everyone in the chat, and then I'll run our sponsors, and then we'll call this one a Sunday evening. And I hope you guys are doing well. And I thank you guys so much for coming out on a holiday week at the beginning of a holiday week. So I just want to say hello to Old Head Deuce. Thank you so much for your wit and for keeping us on our toes. And hello, Melinda Ann Burns. Thank you so much. Let's see, who else do we have here? AZ Infidel. Thanks so much for coming out. And let's see. We have Unique View. Thank you so much for coming in. And I think Killer Whale Channels was here earlier. Thank you so much, Killer Whale Channels, for all that you do. And hello to Steve Willis. Thank you so much for coming in. Joseph Francis Burton, thanks so much for coming in. And Angela Reed, thank you so much for coming in. And hello to the Information Man Show. Thanks so much for coming in. William Welch, thanks so much. And DJ Vision Barnett, thanks so much for coming in. I really appreciate you guys for taking the time. And maybe it inspired some thought there. There's a lot. There's a lot to learn, I think, when it comes to the Catholic Church. But I think I am inclined to think that there's quite a few, that all of these items are a bit advantageous of one another. These, I don't think it's all fragmented, or I don't think these are separate entities anymore. I really don't. So yeah, I don't think these are, I think that these entities are working together, or if you want to call them institutions, they all kind of work together. I mean, look where we are right now. So with that said, I will see you guys later. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. So we'll have a word for the sponsors, and then we will get going with our Sunday. If you're looking for great content creators on the subject of politics, news, culture, scripture, history, automobiles, culture, and much, much more, check out our sponsors: Derek C. Williams, Killer Whale Channels, The Definition of Anarchy, Joseph Francis Burton, Chrysler Imperial H, Little Miss Goth, AZ Infidel, Cold War Jesus, Anthony Scioli, and Let the Truth Be Told. And now, back to the news. All right, guys, I thank you so much once again for coming in, and I thank you guys so much for lending me your ear and also your time to view that interview. I'm not saying that, I think it's interesting perspectives there, and it definitely inspires thought. Some of the perspectives there, but some, of course, I may not do a whole lot with, but it's always good, to have some extra ideas and extra perspectives in these times. So I hope you guys have a great rest of the weekend, great rest of your Sunday, And I will see you guys on the next live stream, in the comment section, or the next video. Bye for now.